Okay, so we are in my favorite part of the Bible. That is the law of Moses. It's not really my favorite. If you remember, I told you oftentimes I would just kind of sleepwalk through it because it's kind of tedious. I find it tedious and kind of difficult. So one of the things I really appreciate is having to teach out of it, because then I have to read it with purpose, right? Tell me, you've all did that this week, right? You read the law with purpose. Yep, you memorized a few passages, right? Let me hear it. No? Okay, it's just me. So, before we get in this, what I really like about this Bible here, the chronological Bible, is that you don't have scattered throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy different laws in different sections. So what happens is a lot of times the similar laws are repeated in those chapters and different books. So it can be kind of confusing. Like, did I just read this? I thought I read this 14 pages back. What I like about this Bible is that it lumps it all together. So this is all of Moses' law. So when we're talking about things with like ceremonial cleanliness, it's all in one spot. You read it one time, and it brings all of the different passages from the different books together. Pretty cool. I got to tell you, I enjoy reading it much better like that than the original way that it's written. Not that this is wrong or anything like that, but it brings it together. It helps my mind focus, because I don't know about you, but if I'm reading these things and another story, then I come back to these laws, I get lost and I don't know what I just read. So this kind of helps me focus. I don't know if that's been, anybody have this Bible? Did you find it helpful reading this? No, we didn't read all of it. We're still in the midst of it, but we've read a good portion of it, and I think it's pretty good. I'm going to get a chair because I don't know if you noticed, but I'm limping. I'll tell you the story how that happened. Blame it on my kids. It's true.
You want this one?
Oh, it's okay, Joey. I got this one here. So I was going outside. It was at night. I had a big bag, and my hands were full. And I told them, shut the door and lock it behind you. I had the porch light on. And they did. As I'm taking a step, though, they turned the light off. So I misjudged the step, fell down, and then I'm ended up under the tree staring up. Thank you for laughing at my pain. So it's now swollen. I don't know. It's ridiculous. But here is the introduction to the law. If you have this Bible, you can turn over to it's 219. I really enjoy also what this author does. He gives little synopses throughout and little bits of information that are helpful. I find it helpful, at least. Okay, so what's going on before this? If you remember from last week, we talked about Balaam, but in last week's reading, it brought us all the way up to the conquest, basically the conquest of the land. So they're on the other side of the Jordan. They're in the Transjordan area. And they're getting ready to cross over, and what they're going to do is take Jericho and then Ai, the city. But this is before that. They've conquered the Moabites and those that were in that side of the river. There was a couple tribes that asked to actually stay there, Manasseh and what was one of them. And Moses had thought at first, you're trying to get out of the conquest. You just want to enjoy this land, and you're not going to support your brothers in their conquest. And after they had a dialogue, no, we don't want to do that. We're not intending to do that. Moses granted them that wish. But Moses, if you remember, he can't go over into the promised land. Anybody know why? Remember why in our reading? Yes. Yeah, so they were grumbling like they always do, in their wanderings about, I'm thirsty, you brought us out here to die, we should have stayed in Egypt. Listen, it's been 40 years, can you please just let go of that? Not the Israelites. They're like, why did you bring us out here to die of thirst in the desert? And Moses talks, remember, to the people or to God, and God says, speak to the rock. Now before, when he performed a similar miracle, he said, hit the rock. But this time, Moses was to speak to the rock, and he basically became angry with the people. Now you might call it a righteous anger, but God judges him for it, so it wasn't that righteous. It was just anger. And instead of speaking to the rock, he hits the rock. Water still comes out, but God judges him and says, because of this, you and your brother, you're not going over to the promised land. So we're in this period of time. Now, God has told Moses, you are going to be gathered to your people. The nice way of saying you're going to die. Aaron has already passed away by this time. And it's Moses' turn. And so what God does is he brings him up on top of a mountaintop, and he can see over all of the area that he can go into, that he's not going to go into, but the people of Israel. And I can imagine that if you're wandering around a desert for 40 years, he's like 120 years old at this point. He's an old man. He probably wants nothing more than to experience that promise that God has given. He's been looking forward that basically his whole life. Since he was even in Egypt, his mother was his nursemaid and probably taught him about the things of the Lord and the promises of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he's been looking forward to this. They came out of Egypt in a miraculous way. They were getting ready to go. Some things happened. The people turned against God, and because of it, they had to wander in a desert. So he's thirsting for the promises of God. And because he messed up, he can't go. And that had to be crushing, I would imagine, to him. Pretty heartbreaking. But God shows mercy on him and brings him up into the mountains and says, take a look everywhere you can see. This is where they're going. So in a sense, God gave him, did him a favor. Did him a solid, if you want to say. And of course, Moses dies on top of the mountain. But before they go over in the conquest of the land, he actually gives them two addresses. He addresses them twice, right? He talks about what they're to do, what they're not to do. He reads to them the entire law. That had to be fun for the people. But I'm thinking it probably would have been different than what we are doing now, because they're looking forward to getting out of the desert. But he is giving them two addresses, and in the address, these laws are given as well. So the people know, and by the end of the time that Moses addresses them, there's a big kind of ceremony thing where they say, we will follow the Lord, we accept the conditions of basically the covenant that God has set before us, we will do everything that he says, okay? Now, this introduction that the author says, he says, at this point, in his second address, Moses begins an exposition of principal law, some of which he gives here for the first time, or at least they are recorded here for the first time, and some of which he has already given, but now further explains or reemphasizes. As indicated earlier, all the laws previously given have been held in abeyance until this section in order to bring the total together to one collective organized by subject matter. And I say to this author, thank you for that. Although these laws are traditionally known as the laws of Moses, it is of course God who is the source. However, because there will be other laws of Israel as the nation becomes more fully developed, it is appropriate to distinguish these early commandments by referring to them as Moses' law. And that's the thing. So God gives, first of all, the 10 Commandments, right? Those were his laws at first. And then as the people continue to wander and things come up, more laws are established. God speaks to Moses. He gives them all of these laws. But that's not the end of it, because as they become a people and they become a nation, more things come up and there needs to be more law given. Does that make sense? No? Okay, good. Making you fall asleep. It's like I'm the law right now. He says here that the explicit purpose for each law is rarely given. That's the thing. Sometimes we read these laws and we're like, what? What? Why did you say that? That's such a weird kind of thing. But understanding that it would have been understood by the people that were receiving it, when it says don't boil a goat in its mother's milk, we're like, that sounds delicious. Why wouldn't you do that? And the people would have been, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. It's because that's what the pagan people around us are doing, and we're supposed to be separated. You don't know that because it doesn't go into all that detail. But understand, it's not all explained why. It doesn't say, thou shalt not do this because, and then furthermore. We don't get that kind of detail, okay? But as we come across some of these things, I'll try to interject some of my thoughts and some of my readings and probably hopefully make it a little more sense, okay? All right. So, however, most of the laws are ultimately designed to teach the Israelites to respect and honor God, to make them holy and aware of their separateness as a specially chosen people, and to learn respect for their rights of their neighbors. Okay. That, I think, is a big key part, okay? Just so we could say it again, it was designed to teach the Israelites respect for God, to make them holy, to make them aware of how separate they were from their neighbors, but also to learn respect for themselves and for others around them, basically, is what he's saying. That's the purpose of the law. We can't get away from that. Sometimes we lose focus of that and things don't make sense, but when we bring that into focus, we're like, okay, I can see, maybe I don't agree with this, but I can see why it would have been said and how that could be beneficial possibly to Israel. Okay. Laws regulating personal injury or even diet are no less significant than those regulating offerings and sacrifices. For all laws are essentially religious laws. That's key. All are given by a personal God and lawgiver to whom the people have sworn allegiance and promised obedience. The laws of Israel may sometimes appear to be cruel and unnecessarily harsh. How many people have agreed with that statement? Right? It seems like you're getting stoned for something, right? Particularly the penalties which accompany given offenses. Yet what may appear to be cruel and unusual in modern times must be viewed in the context of the life and times in which the Israelites were living. Okay, that is a key to any kind of biblical interpretation. If you bring in the 21st century ideals, beliefs, and values and try to put them here in a Bronze Age people, it won't make sense. It'll seem strange. They will seem like barbarians to you, but it's not fair to judge them by our standards because our standards weren't a thing then. Does that make sense? And you could see this in popular culture, right? You can see this, what people are doing now to people that lived in the 50s, 60s, and so on. How could you have said such a thing? How offensive was that? You know? It wasn't offensive then. Was it right? No. But according to the people that lived at that time, it would have been seen as something acceptable. You understand what I'm saying? It's not exactly fair to judge them, you know, how many thousands of years later by our standards. Not cool, so don't do that. Okay, so let's continue. Death and suffering are very much a reality to all people of this time. And in the surrounding nations, wicked kings practice unspeakable cruelties in ruling their people. Thus, the laws given to Moses are designed to lift the national consciousness and impose a high level of ethnic and ethical conduct. Even the death penalty is an elevating concept in teaching the value of human life, and the procedure safeguards which are imposed ensure a measure of unparalleled fairness. In fact, the concepts of due process and equal justice found within this legal system, in our system, will be incorporated even centuries later, oh no, it's theirs, into enlightened systems of modern day. The organization of the laws as presented in this section is purely subjective and therefore should not be taken as an authoritative structuring. That also is huge. How many have heard atheists and people that don't believe in the Bible that say, oh, you believe in God? Okay. Well, which one of you is going to be stoned for wearing an outfit that's blended with 2 or more fibers? What? No, that's not how it works, okay? So we got to keep that in mind. We got to keep that in our understanding. These are not authoritative structures for us. They're not what we should be living by. Why? Because this is an old covenant system. To whom? To the ancient Israelis. For a specific purpose and a specific time period. We are not the Israelites. We are no longer in Bronze Age Middle East. Okay? These are not subject to us. Now, there are universal kind of laws, like honor your father and mother. Don't covet your neighbor's wife or husband for that matter. You know? Don't steal. Don't murder. Those things are universal, and what happens is In the New Testament, all of those universal kind of things are re-emphasized, but not the rest of this stuff, okay? Not to say that it's not valuable. You might say, well, if it's not important, why am I didn't say it's not important. I just said it's not binding to us. It's not an authoritative position for us. Well, I thought all Scripture is authoritative. Stop doing that. That's not what we're doing. We're not chasing semantics here, right? We can learn from this what God requires from people. Generally, the themes are similar. What God required of the Israelites was what? So you're not even listening. You're just droning on. What did God require of the ancient Israelites? Obedience. What else? Worship. Sacrifice. What was that? Holiness. Does God require anything less than us? No, but it looks different. But the idea is the same. So we can take those themes and we can bring them over. Also, if we have a decent understanding of what happens in the law, it opens up a lot of other things we read in the other books. For instance, when we go over the laws of the Nazarites and the Nazarite vow, what Samson does, who took a Nazarite vow and basically broke every single law of the Nazarites, when you read that, you'd be like, oh, that's not good. Ooh, Samson, not cool, okay? So that you understand that. So let's take a look at this. So the first section is religious and ceremonial laws. So this is what God says to Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 5. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Pretty standard, right? Does that apply for today? Yeah. Do we break that law? You better believe it. We might not be bowing down to Ishtar or Baal, but we bow down to ourselves. Our own selfish desires, right? We bow down at the altar of sex and pleasure, don't we? Self-serving in other ways, that we bow down to. It still applies. No other gods. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You should not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am jealous, punishing the children for the sin of the parents in the third and the fourth generation, and to those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay. So God's a jealous God. Has that changed? His characteristics don't change. There's laws against idolatry and paganism. This is what God says. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. That's pretty harsh. But understand this. He is establishing a people for himself. Whoever sacrifices to any other god must be destroyed. You find it interesting that, when Moses brought the people out and he goes up to the mountaintop and he's up there for 40 days, and who knows, maybe day 35, the people are like, this Moses fellow has been gone way too long. I got a great idea. Let's make other gods and they'll go before us. Did that seem weird to you? But it seems like this is what humanity does. So quick to go to other gods. And the Lord wanted very specifically for them to know this cannot be. So he imposes on them the strictest of punishments, which is death, in the hopes that they would keep him, God, the center. What is God's purpose and plan in all of this? Think big picture. Yeah, that's part of it. He wants to build a relationship with them. But what is his overarching, or arching, whatever you want to say, goal for humanity? Trust in him, right? How is that accomplished? I think back to Abraham and God telling him that he was going to make Abraham the head and not the tail. okay? That they would be a blessed people. And that through them and through Abraham and his descendants, all nations of the earth would be what? Blessed. But for all nations of the world to be blessed, they must follow God and be a separate people. So God's missionary plan at this time was for the nations around Israel to see the blessings, to see how diligent they were towards God, to see how they interacted, and for those nations to say, I want what they have. Does that make sense? That was his missionary goal. I want what they have. I see that they never experience famine, that they multiply, their cattle multiplies, that their crops are always abundant. Hey, maybe there's something to them and their God. Through them, all nations of the world to be blessed. That was God's missionary plan. Now, his main plan then was to bring Jesus in the fullness of time and for that covenant to start. But until that time, here we are. It was imperative that the nation was holy and set apart. And it started with their worship of God. Hence why the laws were required. Why? Because they were a stiff-necked people. No different than you and me or anybody else today. Prone to rebellion, prone to go against God. And so God comes out strong here. My wife used to be a teacher, and I remember, she would tell me one of the strategies she would use. She'd be real hard on the kids at first, right? Boom, super hard. No, you can't get up. No, you can't say that. No, you can't get a drink. No, you can't. No. Quiet down. All that kind of stuff. And then as they got with the program, she can be a little looser because they understood. If she started out, permissible for everything, my father-in-law was a teacher, you'd have no rule in the classroom. This is kind of what I see, in an elementary kind of way, what God is doing. He is bringing it to begin with, to show them how serious and important it is. Okay. What is the big deal about the other images? It says, do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourself. Do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God. This is what all the nations around them were doing. They worshipped Baal. They worshipped Ashtar, which was a pole, which kind of symbolized a phallic, which is a penis, because they worshipped fertility, and that was important to them. They wanted to bless their crops. So God, again, is separating his people. You don't do that. They do that. They do the graven images. They do the animals. They do all these kind of symbols and bow down to them. I'm having none of that because I'm different. It's set apart in the way that we look, in the way that we speak, in the way that we act, in the way that we dress, in the way that we worship, and everything that we do, difference. He goes on in Leviticus 20, and the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, any Israelite, any foreigner residing in the land who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death. The members of the community are to stone him. I myself will set my face against him and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Moloch, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. And the members of the community close their eyes when this man sacrifices one of his children to Moloch. And if they fail to put him to death, I myself will set my face against him and his family. And I will cut them off from their people together with all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Moloch. Now that is something crazy, right? To us, it's like sacrifice your kid. But this happened with the Canaanites that were there, that were possessing the land. They worshiped the demon god Moloch, and this was crazy because I saw this in an article and I checked different sources. But outside of Rome, outside of the Colosseum, they had a gigantic statue to the deity Moloch with arms outstretched. Huge, like bronze statues. Look it up, it's crazy. And the Catholic Church set that up, and people were furious because they're like, do you know how many Christians died here? And now you have the death demon Moloch on the outside. It was some kind of exhibition for Midianite and Moabite, Canaanite culture or something like that. And this is one of the things that they had there. But they're like, are you serious? That happened. What happened is they would have, it was a furnace, so to say, where they would put fire and wood inside, and it get really hot. And the arms were outstretched like this and angled up. So when you put your child on it, it rolled down into the fire. And you know what? The nation of Israel was guilty of this. The northern kingdom, when the kingdom split, one of the kings sacrificed his own sons to Moloch. So what God is saying, they didn't follow. And it seems like it took time, but over time they went the way against God. It was crazy. God made a thing of separating them from the pagan people. And Deuteronomy tells them, you are the children of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourself or shave the front of your heads for the dead. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possessions. Then in Leviticus, it says something similar. Do not cut the hair at the side of your head or clip off the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourself. I am the Lord. And we get caught up with this. We're like, what's wrong with tattoos? Well, nothing now, but then that's what the pagan peoples did. In their cults to the dead, in their cults to their God. They would shave themselves a certain way. They would cut their bodies to try to get the attention of the gods. They'd put tattoos on themselves. They'd do different piercings. And that was in their pagan cultural and rituals. And God said no to that. So if you have tattoos, you're okay, unless you're doing up some pagan ritual to Moloch or something, okay? So we get caught up in these things. Again, these weren't for us. This is about a people group that God was leading into a nation that needed holiness, that needed to understand the seriousness of what was going on. Whew. Okay, there's stuff about adulterous cities. I'm going to move past that. Only one place of worship. This is cool. So Deuteronomy 12, and you might look at this and be like, I don't think that's cool. But these are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess as long as you live in the land. Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree where the nations you are disposing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire, cut down the idols of their gods, and wipe out their name from those places. Wherever they were going to possess, whatever portion of the land, God said the same thing. Wipe out their religious practices. Every stone, every altar, every pillar, everything that bears the name of their gods, wipe it out. Destroy it completely. Why? What happened if they didn't? Eventually they would do it, right? Later on, God tells them, when you take possession of the land, do not think to yourself, how did these people worship God? Maybe we should worship in the same way. God says, you must not worship me in the same way that they worship their gods. He even said, it's not that you're worshiping even them, those gods. You're worshiping me in the same kind of way that they worship. That's detestable. Don't do it. And so God says, you must not worship the Lord in their way, but you're to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. So in other words, when you get there, when you get to the promised land, I am going to let you know where to set up my temple. That's where you go to worship. Now I could tell you something that they didn't listen. I know, and I was looking at some archaeological things that were really cool from the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you remember, there was a king after Jeroboam died that set up golden calves, 2 golden calves in Dan. And so this king was really concerned that if they kept going to Jerusalem in Judah to worship, that his people would abandon him and align themselves with Judah, and he'd lose his power. So he's like, I'm setting up these golden calves here. These are your gods. I'm going to set up my priests. You're going to worship here, and we're going to have the high places. Everything's good. And that's what they did. So they had a big temple in Dan as well. And so what this archaeological site said was really cool. They said it's evidence that they worshiped Yahweh, but other deities as well, but primarily Yahweh. And the same kind of utensils that is described to Moses in Exodus, they found in this temple. It's kind of cool. The bowl for collecting blood, different shovels for getting rid of ashes and whatnot. They found an altar that was absolutely enormous. It's pretty cool. But then they also said, along with that, on the high places around the area were shrines and different things where they would also worship other deities. And besides that, in the settlements around the temple where the people lived, they'd find fertility goddesses, little talismans and things of that nature. So it was obvious that besides Yahweh, other things kind of crept in. Someone's calling me, I don't know why. So this is why God is so strong here, because he knows what the tendency of human beings are, and that is to run to idolatry and to run away from him. So it makes it very strong. So one of the things that is against these people groups that are in Canaan is witchcraft. It's divination. Remember we talked about Balaam last week, and he was like a master curser. And not swear, but he would curse people and groups of people. And apparently he and his family were really good at it, right? And part of it was with divination. And what that entitled was a sacrificing of animals, taking the guts of the inner portion, and then looking at those guts, looking for abnormalities and for omens within the guts to see what the will of the gods are. And God said specifically, don't do that. Don't do it. Don't seek it out. I'm against it, okay? So if we look at Leviticus in 19 and 20, and then also in Deuteronomy chapter 18, we see that witchcraft and divination is prohibited for the people. He says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritist or consults with the dead. And that's what a medium or a spiritist is, someone that is consulting with the dead or the spirits around them. Now, does anybody not know what a medium is? I mean, I think our culture is pretty ripe with them, right? I mean, if you look at Lilydale, that's what they do there. And this, for me, people would always talk about going to Lilydale, or they went to a psychic or something to that nature. And they're like, you know what, Mike, it was awesome. That's what we did. My grandfather came through, and it was so peaceful and such a great experience. Like, you should go with me. I'm like, I'm not going with you. They always are shocked at that. Like, why wouldn't you want to talk with your dead grandfather? I'm like, because that's a demon. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, this is what God says. He prohibits that. I can't do that. That is against God's law. Now, this here, the law against witchcraft and divination, still applies to us. You can't just go out and consulting spiritists. Why? What's that? Yeah, because you're really consulting with demons. I had a boss. My favorite job in all of the world before this one, I got to make that clear, is I was a concierge at an upscale apartment complex in Dallas, right? Awesome. I did cookouts, I scheduled parties. It was amazing. Super cool, right? And so my boss, he would get messages from beyond. I remember I was sitting one time in his office, and we had a police officer that lived on campus, and he came in, and he was a friendly guy, and he was just talking, and he was like, yeah, I had a hard case, it was very difficult, but it's just real draining, it's really crazy. And my boss we were talking, and he was like, they somehow got on the topic of being a psychic, right? And he was like, man, I wish you could help me with your psychic power. And my boss was like, well, I don't know. Sometimes things just come to me. And he kept talking. He's like the number 30, for instance. It could mean something. It could be, just a number. It could be how old an individual it is. It could be maybe a highway sign or something like that. And he said, sometimes when I'm just thinking about things come to me. Like I'm envisioning a hill with lots of leaves on the side by water. And he said, and there's a gray van with no windows on the side. And the guy's turning white. He's like, what's going on? The guy says, you are describing exactly where I was today and what I saw today. And the highway that I was on was Highway 30. And then my boss said to him, you consulted with a man with a beard, and you ruled him out as a suspect. And the guy said, yes. He said, that's your man. And there's a gun in that car. Crazy, right? So this guy leaves, and I look at him, I'm like, that's pretty amazing. He's like, it just happens like that. I'm like, who do you think gives you that information? He's like, I don't know. The spirit sometimes, I'm like, you know what I believe who gives you that information? He said, who? I said, Satan. And that surprised him. And we got talking, and I told him, it's kind of like radio signals, except there's only two radio signals. There's one from God through his spirit, and there's one from Satan. And depending if you are God's or not, you'll be receiving certain signals. And we had a great conversation about it, because he was like, you know what? I help people. I said, well, you know what? The people you're helping, you're deceiving. He's like, I wouldn't deceive anyone. I'm like, begging your pardon, but the people that are feeding you this information are demons. What the Bible says are convincing spirits or familiar spirits. And he said, well, what is the goal of that? I said, it's to deceive you. I said, would you turn to God with all this information that you're getting from other sources? He said, no. I said, exactly. They have you. They have you. I said, did you ever have a terrible experience? He says, well, I don't like to talk about that. I said, well, then you know what I'm telling you is true. And he was real open. He didn't convert him or anything like that, but he was real open to the conversation. And after I left there, I haven't had contact with him since, but I always kind of wonder what happened. But God specifically says no to that. And it's enticing for us, right? Because I think as a human population, we want power, we want knowledge, and if you had a loved one that you didn't get to say goodbye to, who wouldn't want to say, hey, how you doing? Or hear something from the great beyond. It's very enticing, and Satan uses that to his advantage to deceive. And God says, definitely not. In Exodus 22, he says, don't allow a sorcerer to live. They were to be put to death in Israel, whenever found. When you see that, when you understand that, when you have King Saul, talking to the witch, and she brings in the prophet. What was the prophet's name? I can't remember. Yeah, Samuel. Thank you. I don't know. I have a picture of him, bald for some reason, I could see that picture. I couldn't think of his name. So then you understand when she realizes it's the king of Israel, she's afraid. Why? Because she knows that the law is to put her to death. So the passage means a little bit different in that time, okay? So it adds a little flavor when you understand the law behind it. That's part of the way it could help. So, It goes on in Leviticus 20 to say, a man or woman who is a medium or spiritist among you must be put to death. You are to stone them. Their blood will be on their own heads. They talk about false prophets and those that talk on dreams. If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a sign or wonder, and if the sign or wonder spoken or has taken place and the prophet says, let us follow other gods, gods you haven't known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer, right? Does that still apply today? Absolutely. False teachers, false prophets. Jesus said in the last time they're coming, right? The ravenous wolves ready to devour. Apparently they were in the beginning here too. Satan has always wanted to do that, to lead astray. And part of the ways is in his wonders and signs. And by telling you things that possibly could come true, or a spirit of some sort that seems familiar, he tries to accomplish that purpose. God says, don't have anything to do with them. Notice he doesn't say they're hokey, that they're fake. No, some of these men and women are legit. They are legitimately hearing from demons. And it seems so sweet and enticing. God says, don't deal with it. And if one comes and tells you about dreams and visions and they come true, and then he says something about leading you away from the truth, nope. Don't have anything to do with them. You mustn't obey. You mustn't serve or hold fast to him. And that person must be put to death. Now you might say, well, do we put him to death now? No. Why? Because we're not the nation of Israel in a Bronze Age Middle East where that law was given. What we do is we have nothing to do with them. And we say, thank you, no thank you. I'm going on. Might expel them from the church if they're in the church. You can't be here. You must go. That sort of thing. But we're not stoning them. So one of the things I think to understand about the law, this book of the law was not intended to be for all peoples in all places for all of time. There was another covenant that God had in mind. That was the covenant that he would write on human hearts when Jesus Christ came, right? And when Christ came, did he do away with all the law? No, he completed it, but he brought us into a new law, a new covenant, okay? That's important to understand. Okay. Any questions so far? I did a lot of talking. Go ahead. 221. Oh, the morning practices: do not cut the hair at the sides of your head or clip the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks. We got that.
Yeah,
Did you want to add something?
no, not that. That does not belong to us.
It doesn't belong to us in that way. So,
But it violates you.
yes, so what happened is that's what the nations around them were doing. And they were doing it specifically for their pagan cults and rituals and spiritual kind of practices. So that's why God's saying, you don't do that. That's detestable. If you do that, you're making yourself one of them. And oh, by the way, if you make yourself one of them, how are we going to bless all nations of the world? Remember, that's his overarching, that's what he wants, right? And you're not going to do that by being one of them. You're going to do that by being separate. That speaks a lot to us today, right? You can't win your friends or families by being just like your friends and families in paganism and going to the bars and sleeping with all kinds of people and cursing and being rebellious in all kinds of ways that the world does it. How do you do it? By, like the Israelites, setting yourself apart. By looking different, by sounding different, by being different, and then God blesses you, right? And in being blessed, they will look and say, you know what? I make fun of you, but what's going on? Why aren't you shaken by all these things? How come? And that's an opportunity, again, to bless all nations of the world. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, that's silly. Out of context. All the time.
I can't remember, you used to have two terms that you used when you were reading the Bible. It's clear to me. Do you remember your terms?
Is it exegesis?
No,
I don't know then.
situational and
Oh, situational clues and purpose clues that are in the Bible. Yeah. We'll talk about that at a different time because I think we don't have enough time for that. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you.
Brother said, like you asked initially the question, Moses, why he was entered into the promised land, because second time he spoke to the rock. Supposed to speak.
He's supposed to, yeah.
That's the thing here, because Exodus 23:22 says, listen carefully, do all things, and I will send an angel before you and put your enemy under your feet,
Yes.
and deliver and everything.
Yes.
So first time in Exodus, God spoke to him, he listened, I think, and God spoke to him, the rock. Then after that, this was happened in the Numbers, book of Numbers, the journey was going through. In the middle, he lost the spirit. God took the spirit from him. When he saw the 70 prophets were spoken.
Oh, yeah, I brought the 70 on him. Yeah.
When he lost the spirit, he was not working. His spirit is not working. He is a little scared, fear, and all these things because of these Israelite people. Then he may not listen carefully what God speaks. Oh, first he spoke to me, then same way he did it the same thing, hit the rock. That's the thing. The Lord, our Lord, for every time he talks differently.
Yeah.
Every time. Even the King David, if you remember it. One time with the Philistine people, you go backward and hit the people, And the second time you go directly. So each time, anything God speaks to us is a different way. That's why we have to listen carefully.
We have to listen carefully. And that's the thing, is obedience, right? And God expected obedience out of the Israelites, and that doesn't change for us. That's another theme that carries over and will carry over until the end of all things is obedience. And, we have the story of King Saul when he was supposed to wipe out the people group and not spare anything. And he kept the sheep and some of the best things for himself and for his men. And, he said, well, let's sacrifice, I'm sacrificing. And Samuel, I believe, and this might be paraphrased or maybe totally wrong, but Samuel said, to obey is better than to sacrifice. That doesn't change. God still requires that of us. And we need to do that. Okay, there are sections here, laws requiring tithing. Yes. Yeah. Be separate from the world. So the concept is the same. The circumstances are different, but the concept is the same. And I think that's important to realize and really understand. Thanks, Boomy. That's exactly what I'm trying to say here. There's laws requiring tithing, okay? So he talks about Deuteronomy 18, 1 through 5, that there's the tithe for the priests. So when Israel would come, any burnt offering would be burned up completely. But other free will offerings and offerings of that nature, the priest would take a portion of that for himself and his family. And why was that set up? It was set up to take care of the priests. They weren't going to have possessions, land. So God gave them the tithe to take care of them. The other portion, there's a portion for Levites. That basically God was going to take care of the Levites as well, because they didn't have a portion in the land. There was a yearly produce tithe. So the first fruits of their labor they would bring in, and that would be for the Levites to take care of them. And then there's another thing called the triennial produce tithe. At the end of every 3 years, again, they would bring a tithe, and that would be for the priests. So what do I say with this? The concept of a tithe has been there, okay? It's been there from the beginning. You know, in all of the New Testament, God doesn't say you must tithe to me. Doesn't say it at all. No tithe of 10% is mentioned, right? So you might say to yourself, oh, I'm free. I don't have to give to God. But understand the concept still flows over into the New Testament. If you look at the book of Acts, when there was need within the church because of persecution and extreme poverty with other believers, what happened? People not just gave, they gave everything they had for the communal use. And so then I like to ask people, which would you prefer? Would you prefer to give 10% or just absolutely everything? The concept is still there. Paul talks about a workman being worthy of his wages in regards to pastors and elders. They should be paid, right? And the tithe goes towards that. So even though God does not specifically say you must tithe, it's like we're not, doing cabbages in our backyard and bringing them to the church, the best of the cabbage or whatever. But we're doing our first of what we make monetarily. And we bring that into God's storehouse. Why? To take care of his buildings, to take care of his workers, and then also to reach the lost. So it's still a very biblical concept. I'm not just saying that because now I get paid out of that. But I do like getting paid out of that. So that's a joke. Maybe not funny to some of you, but I thought it was. Okay, guys, we're going to stop there. I want to encourage you, there's a basket in the very back that has these True Life cards. And this is the way that I'm working this. I'm keeping, 3 to 5 in my wallet. And then I'm praying and saying, God, give the opportunity. As the opportunity comes to me, Lord, help me, first of all, recognize it. And then second, have the courage just to give it out. And when I do, I'm just like, hey, you know what? We had a good conversation here today. If you have any questions about spiritual things, about God in general, all you got to do, this little barcode, scan it with your phone. It'll bring you to a website that you can just look at different things and check it out. And then if you have more questions, here's our church address in the back. Just come to it. Have a good day. That's simple. And you probably don't ever see them again. But it could make a difference in their life, okay? So I encourage you, grab some in the back. There's right on the back of the sound booth, there's a basket with some of these. Take a few of them and have a good day.